Focus today, and boy, am I delighted to have my good friend back with us today, Wallace Henley. He's the Senior Associate Pastor at the Second Baptist Church there in Houston, Texas. We've had him on several times before. He's the author of Globe Quake, and formerly he worked in the Nixon White House under the direction of the late Chuck Colson. And Wallace, what a delight to have you with us today, man. You're looking good. Happy New Year.
Hey, Perry, thank you. And by the way, we've got your weather down here in Houston. It's raining, except it's thundering, but we won't have any snow.
Well, we're going to have snow tomorrow, but don't worry until you start growing skin between your toes. Hey, listen, you've been talking about the presidential mandate and a need for pushback. This president obviously is now starting to govern as if he's got an overwhelming mandate of the people. And what's so interesting to me, there seems to be no regard for the people's wishes whatsoever. He's just doing his thing. How dangerous is this, Wallace?
I have a very great concern. In fact, what I said last week in the Christian Post, I think it's still up there, is that a country is never in more peril than when it has a chief executive who thinks he has a mandate. I lived through this in the Nixon White House when Nixon allowed his own sense of mandate after the 1972 elections to absolutely occlude his vision, block his vision about the seriousness of Watergate, the disaster that brought on the nation. We've seen this across history. It is a time of great concern when there's a sense of mandate.
Well, you know what's interesting about this? He's literally now starting to govern as if he not only has this mandate, but it has the feeling, Wallace, of being dictatorial. I mean, it's scary.
Well, and what happens is a consensus develops in the establishments we've talked about several times on this program. Remember those four establishments that set our national consensus: the information establishment, entertainment establishment, academic establishment, and political establishment. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very dangerous when all of these establishments come into a consensus that this is our leader. Forget any kind of opposition. This is our leader, and we must surround him, and we must give him this mandate. And so that whole mentality is created in the nation. Through all kinds of propaganda mechanisms. That's why I've called in my article for increased pushback. We've got to have pushback.
All right. I can't but help and agree with you. And we got Wallace Henley with us today. How do we start this pushback? I mean, it appears he has the press on his side. He's got control of the Senate. And quite frankly, Wallace, I'm a little disappointed with the Republicans in the House. They just don't seem to be pushing back.
Well, that's because the Republicans, so many of them have become part of that political establishment. You get there. I was chief of staff briefly for a U.S. congressman. I was his district director, and I can tell you that the aura of government itself can so easily pull in people to the point that they embrace that consensus around the mandate. But they're also concerned about getting projects back home and getting money back home. And so all of these things contribute to that, which weakens the voice. You have to have somebody who's willing to go there and say, look, I'm here for one term. I hope I can serve longer, but I'm willing to be here for one term so that I can surface these crucial issues that will, in the end, actually protect the nation.
All right. So how do we start a pushback? I mean, do we find a particular issue and push back, or what do we do?
Well, number one, I'm not a big fan of revolution. Revolution has to become a transformational movement. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about revolution in our country. We can talk about everything from secession all the way across the board. The reality is that a transformation has taken place, and it's a tragic transformation. There's got to be counter-transformation. The way transformations work is always from the bottom up and the inside out. Number one, we've got to have the recovery of a prophetic voice in the pulpits all across the nation. Professor Stout, Harry Stout of Yale University, talked about the impact of the colonial pulpit in setting the stage for the American Revolution, which became a transformational movement, still going on, although it's beginning to peter out somewhat. So the pulpit has to become prophetic. We've got to give pushback to especially the social issue changes that the Obama administration is trying to force on America. Then it has to be small business, small to medium business. Like Hobby Lobby, like Chick-fil-A, like some of the others. By the way, it's thundering. I don't know if you're picking that up.
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
pretty substantially here. But these small to medium businesses, and the reason I say small to medium is because the big multinationals are either very much in the pocket of the administration in the sense of giving a great deal of money to the reelection campaign, or they are looking for their own interest in the event bailouts have to be made in the future. So if there's going to be pushback at the business level, it's going to have to be from these small to medium-sized businesses. So the bottom-up pushback is where it has to start.
All right, I want to come back to the pulpit, if I can, just for a moment. I know that's dear to your heart and certainly is to mine as well. And I'm not trying to be negative here, but I just don't see it. I mean, I don't sense it or feel it. I want to. Do you?
Yeah. Well, where I am, thank God, I do see it. Our pastor, or senior pastor here, is Ed Young, under whom I work. But Edwin and I are of a generation that understands the nature of that. I'm not sure that the emerging church, and I use that both in its official and non-official sense, I'm not sure that the emerging church understands that. What I see is many, many young pastors who are themselves chained to the contemporary cultural worldview. That has become more authoritative to them than the Bible. And so it's very easy then for them to begin saying, we've got to make the church relevant. We've got to make it relevant. We've got to speak to this generation. The problem is, and all you have to do is to look at the American Episcopal Church, the problem is the more relevant you try to become, the more irrelevant you are, because you're just one more voice saying the same thing. And to be truly relevant, you have to speak truth, prophetic truth. And that's going to have to be the nature of the pulpit. I think we're going to see this emerging a little bit more as the situations deteriorate. And unfortunately, that's what we'll call it for.
Well, we're heading down that road. You know, what's interesting is that in 2010, when the House turned over even greater numbers to the Republicans, a lot of those were Tea Party people. And a lot of the Tea Party people were solidly faith-based people. They get there and they get shut down. I mean, you kind of go, oh man, what do we do here?
Yeah. You remember the famous Speaker of the House who gave advice to Lyndon Johnson to go along, to get along, you got to go along. To go along, you got to get along. And that's the mentality that these freshmen are hit with immediately. They go in as idealists. They're going to transform the nation. But the result is they're then brought into this vast complex, which is full of DC think, inside the Beltway thinking, and they find themselves unconsciously beginning to conform to it. Now, the congressman for whom I worked is a congressman by the name of John Culberson, who represents the 7th Congressional District. And John has always been a pushback guy and remains a pushback guy, but they put him out on the edge. They put him on the back benches, even though he's been in the House of Representatives for more than 10 years. And when H.R. 1, I was working for John when H.R. 1, which was Bush's education bill, and John was on the Education Committee. So I was in Washington for a lot of those hearings, and I remember so well how the White House lobbyists serving George Bush pulled us into the cloakroom and said, look, you guys are going to have to go along with this. Well, we knew that Ted Kennedy had helped to co-author that education bill. And we were going to push back, so we kept pushing back. John kept pushing back. Finally, one day, very high-level people called John to the White House, and they said, John, we know you need money for the expansion of I-10, what we call the Katy Freeway going through West Houston. We know you need some federal money for that, and if you want that money for your district, you're going to have to vote for H.R. 1. Well, that congressman had the courage to say, no, I'm voting against it, and he did vote against it, the enlargement of the federal encroachment on public education. And so those are few and far between, and their voices are kept silent very often in the halls of government.
Well, we're looking for some firm leadership in all of this, and I don't want to remain all on the political side, but with your background, Wallace, I'm really concerned we're just not getting the pushback. I mean, this last fiscal cliff thing was a fiasco. Now we're heading towards the debt ceiling, and you just kind of wonder, are we going to collapse under this one too?
Well, you see, the effects of the fiscal cliff have not yet hit the pocketbooks as intensely as they will. And when that happens, these representatives, that's why in my article in Christian Post, I talked about the pushback has to come from the House of Representatives. It's not going to come from the Senate, although we do have some good people there. We've just sent Ted Cruz from Texas, who's a tremendous guy.
Yeah.
But the pushback is going to have to come from the House. The pushback will come when businesses and people start experiencing the full blow of Obamacare and all the other kinds of legislation that is being foisted upon us. That's when it will come. And unfortunately, that's going to take crisis. That's what it's always taken to get us back to where we ought to be.
Well, and I think it'll show up Friday. Friday will be the first time the new paychecks come out with the deductions.
Right.
And you begin to sense and feel it. Wallace, it appears that this president, and there's an old saying, let me back up and say there's an old saying, you don't break God's laws break you. Covenant keepers win, covenant breakers lose. But it appears that this president now is governing without regard to God's laws or even regard to the Constitution. I would assume he's going to stumble over the stupidest thing that's going to get him because he's just not paying attention.
Well, obviously there will come a moment like that. I was thinking this morning, in fact, I'm working on another series for the Christian Post right now, and I was thinking about John Kennedy. When John Kennedy went into office in January of 1961, he went in with a tremendous amount of dazzle and glory and fame, and he almost immediately began talking about having a summit with Nikita Khrushchev. And here was this 43-year-old president who was going to meet this wizened old Soviet leader. Well, George Kennan and even Dean Rusk, who became Kennedy's Secretary of State, they pushed back. They said, don't do that. You're not ready for this. But Kennedy pushed ahead anyway. He went to Vienna in June of 1961. He met Khrushchev, and Khrushchev absolutely made mincemeat out of him. And I'm sure, Perry, that you're not old enough to have been alive at that time, but I can still, I'm joking. I can.
Thank you, brother. I owe you a sandwich.
You're welcome, man. I'll spend $2,000 fly up there so you can buy me one. But they were pushing back, and they were saying, don't do this. And so he was made mincemeat. He came back, and we were terrified. We were chilled because we thought surely Khrushchev will see the weakness of this president and will launch an assault, an attack. And indeed, this nurtured the ground on which the Cuban Missile Crisis developed, and that could have been the end of the world, quite literally, by atomic holocaust. It was a frightening time, and it happened because of a president who kept extending himself beyond his limits. Now, that's my concern about the Obama administration. Even though he's been in power for 4 years, I still think he's ignorant of the extent of the hubris that has embraced him and his administration, and this makes it perilous for the country. That's what it will take, unfortunately, for us to get a wake-up call.
All right. Now, you mentioned in your article about the myth of mandate started by President Andrew Jackson, and then you brought it right up through Roosevelt and others. Highlight that for us.
Well, Andrew Jackson was the first really to intensify this concept. Andrew Jackson felt like that the president was the direct representative of the people, and therefore the president could function if he was elected. The people were saying, we're giving you the mandate to govern and to rule our nation. And of course, that's not true. The House of Representatives is the direct representation, because the House of Representatives is set up on congressional districts where the officers of the members of government are elected directly by the people, and they represent the interest of that district. So Andrew Jackson was entirely wrong. Theodore Roosevelt comes into office, and he comes in as a president who's got this grand vision of what the world ought to look like, and he's going to use America as the big stick to force the world into this vision. And hubris just absolutely takes him over completely. The mandate mentality takes him over completely, and all kinds of things happen in his administration, whereby the White House exerts tremendous power against business, against other types of entities that certainly needed reform, but that reform needed to come and be initiated at different levels. By the time we get to FDR, thank God for FDR, who saw what was happening globally and knew that we needed to stand against the Nazi encroachment on Great Britain and others, and gave us Lend-Lease and so forth. But nevertheless, his mentality, his mentality earlier, mandate mentality, had caused him to develop extensive government control of welfarism and so forth. And it was actually in 1943 that withholding was brought back into the picture. In terms of workers' compensation, withholding tax came into the picture once more. Although we had the income tax from way back, 1913, 1916, withholding comes back as a means to support the war, and it comes into place not through an act of Congress so much as through an act of executive order. And so we see the extension continually of this mandate mentality across history. I've mentioned Nixon and his sense of the mandate that caused him to be blind to the consequences of Watergate. So it's a problem always.
You know, we are sensing a disconnect from the electorate to the elected officials, because the electorate certainly sees the problem, senses the fact that this is a runaway administration with this mandate mentality, and they're just going to push through. There's no regard to anything or anybody, and we don't feel like we have any representation for pushback.
Exactly.
And so my concern is coming back to the churches and the people of faith. I mean, if we're not careful here, we'll be the frogs in the boiling water. I mean, we've got to start some kind of a spiritual revolution.
We do, and I know some people who are very active in helping to do that. And I mentioned my pastor, Ed Young, who is Ed Young Sr. His son, Ed Jr. at Fellowship Church in Dallas, is listened to by a lot of the younger men, and Ed Young Jr. is beginning to push back. He has a very interesting series of sermons going right now on what would Jesus ask or say to, and then he mentioned several people who are shaping our contemporary culture. So we're beginning to get some sense of this, and I pray that this is a snowball that's going to mount considerably and just crush this whole idea of the mandate mentality. But it has to begin with the people. Transformation is inside out. It is not outside in. Outside in is force. But when I accept something, when I internalize something, it begins to transform my life, and it has to be from the bottom up. This is the whole way the gospel moves. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This is Romans 1. God has chosen the weak things of the world. God has chosen the foolishness of the gospel. And that's the recovery that's got to come in the pulpits. And there are people who are trying to nurture that.
You know, you can't help but read the Old Testament and realize that God goes just so far, and then he pulls the rug, so to speak. Do you think it's possible that this president, with his disregard to God's law and the Constitution, could be judged while he's in office?
Well, I'm sure that the president himself will walk, as all of us do, under the judgment that's the form of the consequence of his own choices. And all of us bear that.
Right.
But I wrote a piece several weeks ago, well, right after the election of Obama, in the Christian Post, in which I said, look, Barack Obama is probably the answer to our prayers. And a lot of people got upset about that, but here's what I believe. I know our church, many churches across America, were intensely praying for the outcome of that election. We did 6 straight weeks on Sunday nights called Pray America. And many churches did. I believe, I'm very fundamental in my belief about the Bible. I believe that if we ask in God's name, and if we ask as citizens of his kingdom, who really have the vote in the cosmos, if you will, about what happens, if we ask in his name for his will, I believe that's what we have. And so I have to stand back and I have to say, maybe Barack Obama himself is part of the judgment that is coming to America that will bring us back to that place that we need to be. And remember, there are cycles of nations, and we've talked about this before, where there is a consensus around a reverence for God. In our founding, not everybody was a committed evangelical Christian, but they were either deists who believed in a transcendent God, or committed Christians who believed in a transcendent God to whom everything is accountable. That's the way we started. Then you go through a process in which there is a relapse of memory from that position. And this relapse began and accelerated in the late 50s into the 60s and is just off the charts now. Then comes rebellion. Rebellion is the logical sequitur to a relapse of memory, and we're certainly experiencing this socially, culturally in our nation. Then comes the refiner's fire, which is the consequence. And following the refiner's fire, there's a time of remembrance when people start asking the question, what went wrong? What got off? And then comes a period of repentance. The prophets arise in the period of remembrance when people are trying to get back to truth. And they call people to truth, and a significant mass of people go through repentance. Then there's revival, restoration. The land has rest for 40 years, as it says in Judges. And then again, there's the relapse of memory. And so this cycle goes on and on until it comes into the great judgment and the coming of the day of the Lord.
Do you think the American church now is beginning to sense the feel and the spirit of repentance and perhaps even contrition for letting this happen under our watch?
Well, there are churches with whom I work who certainly have that. And these are churches from New England all the way over to California and down here in Texas and across the South. And so I think there is a remnant, and God has always worked with the remnant. This is why, even in the midst of all this, Perry, I'm still a man of tremendous hope, because I've seen God work historically. I mean, I'm old enough, I've lived a lot of history, but I've studied history, and I've seen that God always works through that significant remnant. And as long as that remnant is in the world, because here's the way God operates. Remember, God is love, which necessitates freedom, which necessitates choice, which necessitates our being able to choose even to rebel against God. But He's always loving. And so He's always looking for a group of people who will turn back to Him, devote themselves to Him, so that He can be invited to work again in the culture, because He pulls His hand back. He says, you can't be free and you can't love if I don't pull my hand back. This is Romans 1. God gave them over. So there's a significant remnant who will always be appealing for God's interaction and engagement with culture. And because of that, there's always hope. When the remnant is removed from the world, that's when immensity of tribulation comes, and that's when judgment follows.
You are a delight. Thank you for the encouragement, and keep up the good work. And where can people get copies of your writing? You got a website?
Yes, sir. WallaceHenley.com. WallaceHenley.com.
Yeah, and you can get all these articles there, and his latest one, Presidential Mandates and the Need for Pushback. Wallace, thank you, my friend. Blessings on you. Look forward to having you often, and keep up the good work, and we pray for you much.
Right back at you, buddy. Thank you.
All right.